After Amalasunta, queen of the Ostgoths, was forced to fight for her rights with the nobility, she had to give her son as a concession to the lovers of the good old barbarian way of life. The kingdom of Ostgoths closed on the internal political struggle, which was immediately taken advantage of by neighbors. The Franks continued expansion and conquered Burgundy and Thuringia. The only thing that slowed down their onslaught on their neighbors were the deaths of Frankish kings. Then brothers, uncles, sons, and nephews of the Merovingians began to lead armies already on their own lands, redrawing the new boundaries of personal possessions. It was the death of the Frankish Theodoric that stopped the Franks on the border of the Visigothic kingdom, allowing it to regroup after the defeat north of the Pyrenees. In Italy, after all the titanic efforts of the queen to establish order, fate continued to deal her heavy blows. Her son and heir, Athalaric, died, most likely, unable to withstand the unexpectedly piled on him after a strict education happiness in the form of incessant alcoholism and partying. The future of the woman whom the Ostgothic nobility tolerated as an exception, and only because she raised the only son of the great Theodoric, was again covered with a gloomy fog. She had to turn for help to her cousin Theodahad, who by this time was living on his estate in Tuscia. The son of Theodoric's sister Amalafrida, who had once been sent to Africa to the Vandals and died rebelling against the next king. Theodahad had already fallen unequivocally under the influence of Italian life, completely losing the militancy inherent in his ancestors. A man of self-interest and indecision, he was well versed in literature and philosophy, but devoted his life to the seizure of the lands neighboring his villa in Tuscia. Amalasunta had once forced him to return the misappropriated lands, and this he had never forgiven her. Now the queen summoned her kinsman and offered him the crown, on condition that Theodahad swore to remain a fictitious king, leaving all ruling and decision-making to Amalasunta. Alas, after solemn oaths and promises, Theodahad immediately betrayed all his words and imprisoned Amalasunta on an island in the middle of Lake Bolsena inside Italy. A letter from Amalasunta was sent to Emperor Justinian, in which she described how she liked her new life on this small island, how pleased she was with her new position, and asked to accept Theodahad as the new rightful king. At the same time, 2 ambassadors were sent to Constantinople, the noble and experienced Romans Liberius and Opilius, and also, at the same time, relatives of the oppositionists killed by her arrived to the unfortunate woman on the island of Martana. The queen was killed in a cruel old Roman way. She was locked in a working bath. Amalasunta's death occurred at the same time that Belisarius crushed the Vandal throne in Africa. The news of how quickly and ignominiously scattered seemed so terrible and warlike southern kingdom quickly spread throughout the world, instilling terror in the hearts of detractors of the empire, and in the souls of those who dreamed of the return of the gray old Pax Romana bright hope. Liberius turned out to be a patriot of the empire and did not do the will of the barbarian king. He, having obtained an audience with the emperor, told him the whole brutal truth with all the details, and on the contrary, urged Byzantium to return law and order to where it came from, in the great Rome, now only a pathetic shadow of the former splendor. The emperor, encouraged by successes in Africa, ordered Belisarius to probe the defense of the Ostgoths in Sicily. The commander Mundu was assigned to test the strength of the Ostgoths in Dalmatia. At the same time, the great politician and negotiator Peter Patricius was sent to Theodahad. Officially, the negotiations were about the status of the Vandal city of Lilybaeum in Sicily. Unofficially, Peter had to convince the Ostgoth that he received the crown unjustly, and to induce Theodahad to surrender the kingdom to the emperor. The Byzantines also sent an embassy to the Franks, showering the Merovingians with rich gifts and urging them to help their co-religionists. So began a strange war without an actual declaration of war. Belisarius, being the only consul, sailed with his fleet along the whole of Sicily, which surrendered to him without offering any resistance. The only exception was the city of Panormi, now Palermo. But even there, after the fleet with arrows approached the city, the defenders, seeing that the masts of the ships on which hung boats with archers were above the wall of the harbor, fell down and surrendered. On the last day of the consulship, Belisarius entered the main city of Sicily, Syracuse. At the same time in Dalmatia Mund, having crushed the Goths who came out to meet him, captured Salona. Probing the defense of the Ostgoths showed that they practically did not protect the borders. When Theodahad learned of this, he completely lost heart. Taking advantage of this, Peter, as an experienced negotiator, forced him to sign a new treaty with Justinian on the following terms: cession of Sicily, annual payment, and regular provision of troops to the empire. Theodahad was deprived of the right to judge by capital punishment and to appoint senators, and undertook always to mention the emperor's name before his own in solemnities and ceremonies. Moreover, increasing Theodahad's fears, Peter obtained from him a second, even more humiliating secret treaty, in case Justinian did not accept the first. In such a case, Peter promised to give the emperor a second option, a complete cession of Italy for a pension. Embraced by fear, Theodahad already thought nothing, and has taken from Peter an oath that it will tell to emperor about the second contract, only if Justinian will not accept the first. Together with Peter and Constantinople have gone and Gothic officials, including Pope Agapetus. As the Book of Popes tells, upon arrival in the capital he first of all entered into religious disputes with the emperor, and then could not or did not want to prevent Peter from providing Justinian with the second treaty, depriving the Goth of his crown. In the light of unsuccessful negotiations, it can be assumed that the death of the Pope in a foreign land spared him from the fate of John I. Meanwhile, the Goths, having recovered from the initial shock, gathered their scattered detachments and approached Salona, where in a skirmish was killed the son of the commander, Munda. The grief-stricken father rushed into battle with the new army of Goths and died in the thick of the fight, so that when the defeated Goths reassembled in one place, they learned of the retreat of the decapitated army of the Greeks. The news that Mund was killed and Salona, controlled by no one, again returned under the power of the Goths, unusually encouraged wimpy Theodahad, and he decided to wage war. If we take into account that modern historians estimate the mobilization capacity of the Ostgoths, about 150,000 warriors, Theodahad could successfully fight off the empire, which had to conduct or landing operations across the sea, or make a long march to Italy through the Balkans. But alas, the Italian kingdom was in deep political crisis, the local population did not support German rule, and society was split religiously. The Byzantine diplomat Peter Patricius arrived in Ravenna to finalize the existence of the Ostgothic state. A treaty had already been signed on both sides, but during this time Theodahad's mood changed. He read the ambassadors' cover letters, then ordered them imprisoned, where Peter would spend many long years, until he could be exchanged for the Ostgoth ambassadors intercepted on their way to Persia. At the end of spring, the hostilities continued. Belisarius crossed from Sicily into Italy and moved, meeting no resistance, northward. As during the African campaign, along the coast following his small army moved his fleet. Ostgoths in the southern half of Italy was generally very few. Some of them retreated to the north. Some did not take any action at all. And the first obstacle in the way of Belisarius was a large and well-fortified city of Naples. In the city was about 800 soldiers of the Gothic garrison. The local aristocracy strongly hesitated, and soon Belisarius met with one of the representatives of the city, who tearfully begged to spare the city from the agony of choice, to open the gates or to keep the siege. The townspeople's arguments were simple. What would happen to them if the Byzantines left and the Ostgothic power returned to the city? They would be declared traitors and tried. Belisarius was begged to take Rome, after which all the remaining cities will surrender after the capital with a clear conscience. Belisarius in response urged Naples to decide, reminding them that they actually choose between fighting for their freedom as citizens of the empire or slavery as a second class of people in the state of the Ostrogoths. In any case, war had already come to Italy, and if the Ostgoths won, the slave position of the Latins would only worsen. Opponents of the surrender of the city offered to expose Belisarius to some conditions in surrendering the city, which he instantly accepted, and this was heralded as a sign of Byzantine weakness. "Look, he agreed even to our humiliating conditions. It means he is not confident in his strength," said those who had already comfortably settled under the Goths. The Ostgoths who remained in the city promised that they could easily hold the city by guarding it on the walls. Jewish merchants assured that the city had enough supplies for a long siege, so Naples closed its gates. Belisarius really did not have sufficient forces to successfully besiege a well-fortified city. The blocked water supply could be compensated by a few working city wells. Several assault attempts were easily repulsed with losses to the barbarian federates in the imperial army. Meanwhile, the fall of this unusually cold year was already well underway. The commander did not know whether to abandon the siege and move to Rome, or to stay near Naples for the winter, or even return to Sicily. Suddenly he had a chance to try to take the city on the sly. A curious Isaurus from the Greek army was wandering around the city and was looking at the dried-up water pipe, when he noticed that the way of water into the city was blocked by a natural rock in which a gap had once been cut, sufficient for the flow but too narrow for a man. Isaur studied the passage and realized that if he widened it a bit, he could get inside and be under the walls, and there were no bars or other barriers. Very quickly a plan of action was drawn up, a few soldiers of Belisarius quietly scraping the rock, widening the gap, and the rest of the army began to prepare for a general assault. It was decided to take the city through a section of the wall near the waterworks. The hour of X has come. The armies stealthily moved into position. Specially assigned men distracted the Goths who stood on the walls with talk. 400 selected soldiers of Belisarius for a long time did not dare to go to the loophole. Finally sneaked inside, handed over weapons and armor, armed themselves, and went through the deep, dried-up aqueduct, the walls of which did not allow to get out. Finally, somewhere in the middle of the city, they found a place where the wall of the aqueduct had partially collapsed, and tree branches were hanging from the top. One by one, the soldiers, in front of a surprised woman, made their way to the courtyard of the town hut, then gathered themselves and ran back to the wall. Quietly seizing a piece of the wall was not possible. The city began to alarm. While the warriors were holding the part of the fortifications they had captured, help was already coming from outside. Suddenly it turned out that the ladders did not reach the height, so the order was given to connect the ladders 2 by 2. All this, of course, slowed down the assault. While on the walls there was a fierce battle, the Goths threw there all their forces, and the detachment of Belisarius from the other side of the city came close to the city gates and lit them on fire. The few defenders of the wall in that place fled. The Imperials, having waited until the gates burned down, knocked them out and stormed into the city, massacring the population. The city fell. Belisarius, having gathered the population in the square, freed the inhabitants of the city from slavery, in which they were hastily taken by the attackers, made a speech that the inhabitants should rejoice at the return of the empire, and moved on with the army. Until winter came. In response, the grateful inhabitants massacred the instigators of the defense, and then went on with their lives, glad to be left intact. All about the fall of Naples made an oppressive impression on the Ostgoths. All the time of the siege Theodo had spent in Rome, practically inactive and negotiating with the Franks, whom he clearly feared more than the detachment of Belisarius. Theodo had promised the Merovingians in exchange for neutrality Arles and the surrounding area, thus still opening the Franks access to the Mediterranean Sea, which they have not yet been able to penetrate through the Visigoths, firmly entrenched in Carcassonne. The army of Italy, meanwhile, was in the fields halfway between Rome and Naples, and, learning that Belisarius was moving towards them, completely revolted. The king's absence showed the Germans his cowardly nature, and the Goths chose a new leader, Vitiges. Ignorant but well regarded during the battles in the east of the kingdom, Vitiges became the new king of the Ostgoths, breaking the oldest of the Germanic dynasties, the Amals. The last king of this lineage, learning of the treason, fled to Ravenna. He was followed by one of Vitiges's warriors, who had a personal grudge against the king. He did not fulfill his request for marriage, giving his bride to another. This Goth, full of rage, chased the king along the road to the impregnable Ravenna, and, having caught up with him, fell to the ground and immediately killed him like some animal sacrificed to the ancient bloody gods of the north. Thus ended the Amal dynasty, which until 10 years ago had ruled half of Europe. Vitiges did not fight with Belisarius, having decided to strengthen his power first, to gather all the forces of the Goths in one fist, and so retreated to the north. In Rome he left a large garrison, which as the Byzantines approached more and more came to despondency and finally fled. On the same day when through the open gates in Rome began to enter the detachment of Belisarius. Thus for the first year of the war the southern half of Italy, practically not inhabited by the Goths, completely passed under the control of Byzantium. Belisarius received ambassadors from neighboring cities, engaged in strengthening the Roman walls and writing reports to the capital. How his 7,000 detachment will confront the huge Ostgothic army Vitiges, we will learn in the next series.